Dr. Wakefield is an academic gastroenterologist and filmmaker. He received his medical degree from St. Mary's Hospital Medical School at the University of London in 1981. He was awarded a fellowship of the Royal College of Pathologists in 2001. He has published over 150 original scientific articles, book chapters, books, and invited scientific commentaries. In the pursuit of the possible links between childhood vaccines, intestinal inflammation, and neurological injury in children, Dr. Wakefield lost his job, his career, his fellowships, and his medical license. He is the director of the documentary film Vaxxed, and he is co-founder of the Autism Media Channel. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andy Wakefield.
Thank you. It's a wonderful, great pleasure to be here again. I've also lost my voice, which I hope holds up. There you are. Anti-vaxxers are spreading false claims as people die from measles. 2 people have died in the last 10 years from measles in the United States of America. And the VAERS system that Peter talked about earlier has recorded many hundreds of deaths from the MMR vaccine. It has an estimated, by a Harvard study, 1% true reporting rate. In other words, the rate of adverse reactions is 100 times higher than you see in VAERS. So you can take that in the context of the data that Peter showed you, that the adverse reaction rate for the human papillomavirus vaccine is much, much higher than is recorded in VAERS. So, at least I feel like I'm in good company now. How did this all begin? And it really, let's go back in history to try and understand how this all started, about the perception of man and microbe in the universe, what our respective roles were we friends or enemies? We were originally perceived to be great enemies, and this is the father of modern microbiology, Louis Pasteur, saying, if it is a terrifying thought that life is at the mercy of the multiplication of these minute bodies, it is a consoling hope that science will not always remain powerless before such enemies. In other words, the microbe, in this case, many of them bacteria, were perceived as an enemy. This wasn't right or wrong, it was just a perception at the time. And of course, infectious disease was a major cause of morbidity and mortality at that time. There was nothing, for example, that one could do about syphilis other than to treat it with mercury and make things much, much worse. So it was a function of the time in which they lived. But we now know, of course, that we are, in fact, about 9/10 microbe, 1/10 human, that we depend for our health upon our microbiome, that no man is an island. Bugs are friends for the most part. So it's an extremely interesting change that's come about in really 100 years. It all began at St. Mary's Hospital on September the 3rd, 1928, which in fact is my teaching hospital, when Sir Alexander Fleming came back from his vacation to discover that Petri dishes of Staphylococcus that he was growing were contaminated with a mold that was inhibiting the growth of the Staphylococcus. Pasteur himself said, in the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind, and it was the prepared mind of Sir Alexander Fleming that led to the discovery, of course, of penicillin. He called this mold juice at the time, and it was an interesting laboratory observation. It was left to Howard Florey and Ernst Chain at Oxford University to make penicillin a commercially viable, mass-produced product. 1940s, in the middle of the Second World War, saw the era of antibiotics begin, and a turning point in the perceived war on infectious disease. The outcomes of diseases that were hitherto untreatable, like neurosyphilis, battlefield gangrene, scarlet fever, were completely rewritten. This was, at that time, perceived to be the greatest thing that medicine has ever done. This was a miracle. However, within less than 100 years, the miracle turned to something else. And of course, bacterial resistance is now a huge problem. It came about through a combination of factors. The inappropriate use. So, for example, general practitioners saying, oh, your child has a pink eardrum, let's put him on amoxicillin. Oh, it hasn't worked, let's put him on another dose. Let's put him on a more powerful antibiotic, when the child never had an infection in the ear in the first place. Or pharmaceutical companies pushing more and more powerful antibiotics into first-line treatment because they got greater revenues from those. The widespread use in animal husbandry, but most importantly, is the exquisite ability of these microorganisms to change, to adapt, and to survive. They will survive. And they have an extraordinary capacity to do that, which becomes by degrees more successful with time. And we are now, in the words of public health officials, in the period of the antibiotic apocalypse. So miracle has turned to nightmare. And the evolutionary selection pressures that drove the development of such resistance have generated more dangerous, more pathogenic strains. So now wards are having to be closed, surgical units are having to be closed, hospitals are having to be closed because of these multi-resistant, highly pathogenic organisms. The antibiotic apocalypse is on us, and an estimated 50,000 people are dying per year. The projected figures are much worse. So in less than 80 years, we have reached what they describe, not me, what the head of the Department of Health in the United Kingdom describes the end of modern medicine. It's a salutary lesson. And the question here is, are vaccines destined for a similar fate? And I suspect they are. Fatal measles case highlights the importance of herd immunity in protecting the vulnerable. Now, herd immunity is one of those concepts that gets bandied around in the news media all the time now. We have to maintain herd immunity by compulsory mass vaccination, or those who cannot be vaccinated, who are susceptible by virtue of being on steroids or chemotherapy, those who are in remission from cancer will succumb to these infectious diseases. And so for the greater good, we must all be vaccinated. And this is what is being used by the industry and the media to push the politicians to pass mandatory vaccination laws in this country right now. And there is a will, there is a desire to have vaccination from cradle to grave. The World Health Organization said this the other day. We want mandatory vaccination, every man, woman, and child, from cradle to grave, to subscribe to our vaccination policy, including compulsory HPV vaccination. Not even cradle to grave, I lie. In fact, from utero, in utero to grave. For pregnant women to receive multiple vaccines during pregnancy that have never been tested in pregnant women, to grave. And that interval from cradle to grave may actually therefore be very short. So herd immunity. What is herd immunity? This is an absolutely key question. It's one of those issues that comes up in public debate, in discussion with your friends, on Facebook, wherever it may be. What is herd immunity? Let's try and understand it. It's extremely important. I want to separate it into two. I want to separate it into natural herd immunity in the pre-vaccine era, and then quasi-herd immunity in the vaccine era, if we are to understand it. And the first thing we need to do is to define it. What was herd immunity in the pre-vaccine era? What was natural herd immunity? Herd immunity was the presence of adequate immunity within a population against the infection that operated to protect those at high risk of infection, serious infection, and to avoid that serious infection and consequently reduce serious morbidity and mortality, in this case from measles. In other words, herd immunity did not act to prevent infection. It acted to encourage infection when it was safest. Let me explain. And it evolved over time. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, this graph is so important. I could show you this graph for every developed country in the world, and I could show you the same graph for the great majority of infectious diseases, whether there was a vaccine for that disease or not. This is a graph of the United Kingdom from 1920 onwards. This is the mortality from measles virus infection. Now, this is mortality. This is death rate. Morbidity. Mortality is effectively the worst end of the severity of morbidity. You get a serious infection, you die. So you could draw this graph for the severity of measles morbidity as well, the severity infection. 1,200 per million children were dying during epidemics way back in the 1920s, before the 1920s. It was a killer of children. And then there was this precipitous fall in case fatality rate, an extraordinary fall in case fatality rate, such that there was a 99.96% reduction in case fatality rate by the time the vaccine came in. This was nothing to do with medicine. It was nothing to do with the introduction of antibiotics to treat secondary bacterial pneumonias, which are often the cause of death in people with severe measles. This is natural herd immunity. How did it come about? It's fascinating. It's fascinating. The first question is, what would have happened if we'd never introduced a vaccine? Well, we don't know. We can only speculate because, of course, we introduced the vaccine. But based upon the shape of that curve, it is highly likely that it would have declined to a mortality of 0, or approaching 0, if we'd never intervened. In other words, measles was becoming a milder and milder and milder disease over time, and that was happening, in terms of the geological history of this planet, it was happening in the blinking of an eye. It was an extraordinary effect, natural herd immunity. To understand why, we need to understand what happened historically. Let's take a typical American family. John Boy. John Boy is the oldest in a large family of children. John Boy is low birth order. He's the first child born. He does not experience his infections early in life because he's got no siblings to infect him. He's at home. He doesn't get infected. He only gets his infections late when he goes to school, and he encounters them in the community as an index case. He gets a brief exposure to measles, and he has a natural measles infection and recovers. He has a moderately low-dose exposure later in life. But he comes home and he infects his home-dwelling siblings. And so they get infected before they go to school. The younger you are, the higher the birth order that you are. Like this little girl down here, his youngest sister, she will be infected at home. And when you're infected at home, the age of exposure is lower and the intensity of exposure is greater. Why? Because I come home as the index case, John Boy, and I cough and splutter and sneeze all over you for a much longer period. I infect you with a higher dose of virus. And if we, for example, live in cramped quarters, share a bedroom, or share a bed, I'm going to give you a proportionally higher dose of exposure still. So birth order and family structure are major determinants of the age and dose of exposure to infectious disease. They're very important proxies. And so you can imagine historically, when slum dwellings were very common, and the density of population was great, and family sizes were great, and comorbid diseases were common, and nutrition was not great, and sanitation was virtually absent, that in those circumstances, the dose of exposure, particularly to younger siblings, was very, very high. And it was therefore in those that the morbidity and mortality was greatest. But that changed over time. And as living conditions improved and family sizes diminished, and living dwellings improved as well, and sanitation improved, then ultimately the outcome of that infection changed. It didn't change because of vaccines or antibiotics, it changed because of those patterns, changes in patterns of transmission of the virus. There were two key elements to natural herd immunity. The first is that a single exposure to measles led to lifelong protection. Such was the nature of the development of the immune response to natural measles that once you had been exposed, you were immune for life. And that protected you. Measles mortality and morbidity is greatest in the very young, under 1, and in adulthood, getting progressively worse as you get older. It is a safe, mild disease in childhood. So by having measles in childhood and developing lifelong immunity, you are protected from developing measles later in life when it's a more serious disease. That is the first part. The second part is passive maternal immunity. But the mother who has had measles infection, natural measles infection, confers extremely good protection upon her fetus transplacentally and her infant in breast milk that leads to prevention of infection in infancy, in the first year of life, until intuitively the immune response of the baby, the child, is such that it can then deal with the infection in a robust way. So these two key elements, one exposure equals lifelong immunity preventing infection in adulthood, and passive maternal immunity protecting infants under the age of 1, are the two key elements to natural herd immunity. And what they do is to constrain the age of exposure to measles, and in measles infection, to childhood, when it is a mild disorder. Those are the two key elements, constraining the age of exposure to a time when it is least harmful. And this is the consequence. It's an extraordinary graph. And there is no way on this earth that vaccination can ever compete with the efficacy of natural herd immunity. Nothing could compete with that. That is an extraordinary effect. Now let us turn to the vaccine era. This began at Harvard Medical School when in 1954, Enders and Peebles isolated measles for the first time from David Edmonston. This was the beginning of the measles vaccine, and in fact the first generation vaccine, which was called Edmonston B. It was then put on the market and withdrawn because it was so toxic, it was so severe in its reaction that it had to be given with immune globulin and was totally useless as a public health measure. But there were several factors driving the system at the time, and that is the perceived success of the polio vaccine. If we can do it for polio, we can do it for anything. And there was also competition. It's interesting, at this time, through Kennedy, the CIA became involved, and vaccination was perceived to be, for America, a currency, a way of convincing third world countries of the benevolence of America and therefore influencing their political structure. And papers recently released under the Obama administration confirmed the investment of the CIA and American foreign policy in vaccine programs. And that largely drives why we are where we are today in this issue. And there was in particular, rather like the missile crisis, a competition with the USSR at the time. Russia had what was called the Leningrad 4 strain, and they were conducting clinical trials, and America wanted to get ahead in this game. So at 1961, there was a meeting at the NIH. JFK sent a letter to that meeting describing measles as a formidable and widespread threat. And there was a voice of reason at that meeting, and that was Sir Graham Wilson from the United Kingdom, who was the world's foremost authority on microbiology at the time. And he said, measles is one of the inevitable but recently unimportant maladies of childhood. In England, and I dare say the US, 1 in 100,000 dies. In Scandinavia, 1 per million. What is peculiar about that child? Should we not be asking what is different about that child that makes them susceptible to death from this infection, rather than perceiving the benefit, the potential benefit of mass vaccination to be the answer. So at that time, Scandinavia had effectively achieved universal infection with the eradication of death. He said, what is the real burden, and what is it about the child who dies that merits further study? To introduce a vaccine without this further study would be unethical. That further research was never done. Dr. Langmuir, who was at the time the head of the CDC and the envoy there for JFK, quoted Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first man to scale Everest with Sherpa Tenzing. When asked why he scaled Everest, he said, because it was there. This was his answer to why we should introduce a measles vaccine. This is the scientific background, because it was there. He went on to say, in the measles, the US is a disease the importance of which is not measured by disability or deaths, but by human values and the fact that the tools which promise effective control and early eradication are becoming available. This is an extraordinary statement. So what you hear in the newspapers now and on the mainstream news media about measles being a major killer, that was not the reason that the vaccine was introduced. It was not because of disability or deaths at all, because it wasn't perceived as a killer at the time. That wasn't the reason. It was because of human values. I don't understand that. What does that mean? What does that mean? And then you have the promise of effective control and early eradication. The sincere belief and assurance that eradication was achievable not only in fact, but within a short space of time. Enders himself, who isolated the virus, won the Nobel Prize for the first time, said a measles vaccine is desirable only if it conferred immunity comparable to that afforded by the natural infection. That is, one exposure, lifelong immunity. And natural measles equals lifelong protection, while a transient, and he said this, while a transient or imperfect vaccine would produce a more dangerous disease when measles is then experienced beyond childhood, when the vaccine immunity has disappeared. So an imperfect vaccine, in contrast with natural herd immunity, would act now to displace the age of exposure to those extremes where it becomes a more dangerous disease. Could we and should we? Should we have just left well alone? Should we have listened to Enders? Should we have listened to Sir Graham Wilson at that time? Should we have let nature just do its job? But vaccinologists won the day. Of course they did. They had the backing of the White House, they had the backing of the CIA, they had the backing of the pharmaceutical industries. And this is what they promised in their certainty. Vaccinologists, in their certainty, promised protection from a single shot. This will emulate natural immunity. It will be lifelong. There will be no permanent injury, brain damage, or death. Measles will be quickly eradicated. The vaccine virus cannot be shed or transmitted to susceptible individuals, albeit that it is a live viral vaccine. These were certainties. I now am a filmmaker, and in films you're always looking for a protagonist in your script, in your movie. The arc of whose story do we follow? Who changes most? Who is the protagonist? And that protagonist has to have a fatal flaw. A flaw which they either address in the context of the film, and they deal with, and it's a comedy in Aristotelian terms, or one which they fail to address. And it's a tragedy. And for vaccinologists, it's certainty. And this was by Dr. Johnson, who is on the IOM's committee and also a pediatric immunologist from the University of Colorado in Denver. Vaccinologists do not entertain uncertainty. Peter will laugh at this because, of course, uncertainty is fundamental to science. How can you be certain about anything? Yet they're certain. that everything they said about the vaccine was right. Louis Pasteur himself said the greatest derangement of the mind is to believe something because one wishes it to be so. So which of those promises of these certain vaccinologists in 1961 to the NIH and to the public and to the White House and to everybody else, which one of those promises has been kept? Not one. Not a single one. What happened in the real world? And the early observations is after the honeymoon period of measles vaccination, the decline in measles. In the 1970s and 80s, there were measles outbreaks. It came back, and this was in school-age children. In other words, in the normal age of measles. And this accounted for the majority of reported cases. 42% of those who had been vaccinated were cases of measles, so that's unusual. That really breaches the first rule that you should produce one exposure and lifelong immunity. You can see this graph, which shows the US and Mexico here, and you see this decline, and this is the number of reported cases of measles, a decline in the number of reported cases, and then a resurgence at this point here. In 1989, there were 170 outbreaks. This is up from a median of 40 to 50 per year in school-age children. And this increased through the 90s. And now there was a displacement of the age of infection into from school age to college-age students. The suggestion that in some people the vaccine immunity was waning. 80% of those had been appropriately vaccinated. Another example, in Texas, an outbreak was sustained in 2 schools, despite the fact that nearly 96% of children had immunity derived from the vaccine, whatever that means. The conclusion of this paper was that epidemics of measles can be sustained in school-age populations despite very high vaccination rates. So one dose does not protect in the way that natural measles protects. And later in that epidemic, most importantly, there was a shift from school-age children to now preschool children, who, of course, many were unimmunized. The highest rate was in those under 1. So now the age has shifted to those in whom the disease is most serious. Among those affected children, between 15 months and 4 years, 44% had been immunized. So again, a primary or secondary vaccine failure, and death rates, most importantly, were highest amongst younger children. The shift in age, and therefore the morbidity and mortality, was in some way a consequence of vaccination. This is an extremely unwelcome notion in public health. The answer of the system is to boost. Just give another dose. Just give another dose. And that didn't work either. This is a viral outbreak in Finland in 1989. It was called an explosive school outbreak. 51 cases of measles in high school students. 63% had had 1 to 3 doses of the vaccine. Again, what's interesting is those infected at high dose, high intensity, in other words, those secondary cases infected at home, or those who shared a bedroom, had a much higher rate of infection, despite the fact that they'd had 2 or 3 doses of the vaccine. In other words, high-dose exposure was able to breach the barrier of even multiple doses of the vaccine, so it didn't protect. Why? Was it non-compliance? No. We've seen that many of them were compliant. Primary vaccine failure is those in whom immunity doesn't develop in the first place. They say that 5 to 10% of people will get vaccinated but won't develop immunity. That's worrying. Secondary vaccine failure, the vaccine fails. So over time, there is a rapid fall-off in the neutralizing antibody or the protective antibody to the virus, despite boosters. And then there's this concept of tertiary vaccine failure, which is a problem that is haunting Merck at the moment with the mumps vaccine. Merck, as you probably know, are in court in Pennsylvania for having faked the efficacy of their mumps vaccine because it was a failure. It was a total and utter failure. And so in order to persuade the FDA that they should keep their license and therefore their monopoly of MMR in the United States of America, they would fake their data by adding rabbit's blood in the laboratory to the test. This produced an artifactual increase in the rate of seroconversion or presumed seroconversion to mumps. And it was a lie. It was a complete lie. And two of their employees who were asked then to go and simply cross out their numbers and change them are suing them in Pennsylvania for fraud. That's a very, very important case. Merck have recently failed in their motion to dismiss this case from the court, so it looks like it will go to trial. It's a huge issue, and you'll see recently a warship was quarantined at sea because there was an outbreak of mumps on that warship in those who had been compulsorily highly vaccinated, the Navy. And of course, this is clearly a threat to national security once your troops are compromised in this way. So, Merck have a problem. How has this come about? One of the things that's interesting, and I'll be very brief on this, is as with everything in life, we require balance. And the immune system, very briefly, very simplistically, in terms of dealing with viruses, has two elements: the humoral immune response, the antibody response, generated by B cells, plasma cells, and the cellular-mediated response, the cytotoxic T cell response. And these are intended to deal with extracellular virus, in the case of the antibodies, which neutralize the virus, and intracellular virus in the case of cytotoxic T cells. And that's the way the system is developed. But unfortunately, the way in which we select vaccines is that we select vaccines which give a very high antibody response and don't give rash or fever. But that may not be the best thing to do, because what we're doing is biasing the virus there we're selecting as the vaccine virus as one that stimulates what's called a T helper cell type 1 response, a 2 response, and overproduction of antibody, and one which attenuates the cytotoxic T cell response, the Th1 response, which is the rash. The rash is the beginning of the healing of measles, and if you select a vaccine virus that doesn't produce a rash, you're producing one that may not be producing an adequate cytotoxic T cell response. So by virtue of the way in which we produce vaccines, we may be biasing it away from an adequate cytotoxic T cell response. And we know from dealing with viruses like hepatitis C that if there is an inadequate cytotoxic T cell response, we are encouraging the emergence of escape mutants of the virus that may become problematic. So here's the question. The first question is, should we fear measles? We're told to fear it in the media. Should we fear measles? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes, we should. Why? Because all of our vain assumptions that were made about our ability to mutate, to exploit, to exert dominion over this virus have been thwarted. Nature will mock the high ceilings of our ambitions. Nature will find a way. There's a great scene in Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park film, where they're in the laboratory and Sam Mendes is looking at this hatching egg, and it's a velociraptor. And he said, "Oh my God, you've bred a velociraptor." And excuse my nose is running. And the Japanese scientist in the white coat says, "Don't worry, it's absolutely fine. They're all female. They can't reproduce." And Jeff Goldblum steps in as the chaos theory mathematician, and he says, "You don't understand. Nature will find a way." And that's the answer. And of course, nature did find a way in that film, and a lot of people got eaten as a consequence. But nature will find a way. You cannot, in your exquisite arrogance as a vaccinologist, a public health doctor, believe that you can exert dominion over you can mutate these extraordinary agents that have this collective intelligence that will survive despite anything, and believe that you can conquer them, that they will not find a way. It's just a matter of time. So, It's important to bear in mind that measles is not one thing. It's a swarm of quasi-species. Whether it's the vaccine or whether it's the natural infection, you have a dominant strain. But it's a swarm of quasi-species. And the problem is that among that swarm, there may be a virus, a quasi-species capable of eluding immunity and causing severe disease, one which we do not have immunity against. And the fact that measles is infecting and spreading among those with vaccine-induced immunity means that that wall of vaccine-induced immunity, whatever it is, has already been breached. Here's an example for whooping cough. The vaccine for whooping cough doesn't work as well as it used to, and new research suggests it's largely because the bacteria behind the disease has mutated. And that's where we are. And that's where we are. That's where we're going. So we are seeing the reiteration of the antibiotic story all over again. Experience with horizontal transmission. This is the transmission now we're talking about from a vaccinated individual to a susceptible individual. Suggests that the vaccine itself may be the source of that mutant. An escape mutant that eludes the immune response to the vaccine virus in a population with no effective specific immunity behaves like a virgin soil population. What do I mean? In the 1960s, the American Atomic Energy Commission, CDC and others decided to conduct an experiment in the Yanomami Indians in the Orinoco Basin. They had never been exposed to measles. They wanted to see how a vaccine like the Edmundston B, bear in mind that was the vaccine that was so reactive it had to be stopped, banned in America. They took the existing stocks and they went down to the Orinoco Basin and they injected the Yanomami with that highly reactive vaccine because they could. They told them they were doing them good. They also injected them with radioisotopes at the time to compare them with the survivors of Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of the Yanomami died. The infection spread from the point of vaccination and followed the course of the vaccination train right out. They developed disseminated intravascular coagulation in many other cases. They called it black measles, and they bled to death. And this was their idea of science, and this was exposed by Patrick Tierney in his book Darkness in El Dorado. I commend it to you. But this is what happens in a virgin soil population that has no specific immunity to a novel infection. So are we sitting on a time bomb? Are we producing a population that is increasingly susceptible to a variant of a measles virus that might emerge by virtue of the genetic selection pressures that we are placing on it by virtue of using imperfect vaccinations up against this disorder? Another film, I Am Legend. Oscar Wilde once said that, that science mimics art, life mimics art, and here is one such case. This is about a mutated measles virus that was used in trials to cure cancer, and in fact it behaved like an escape mutant. It got out into the population and it killed everybody. And the problem for them is that it didn't just kill them, they then came back as flesh-eating zombies. This is New York. It's not so different from New York today, but it just gives you a frame. I am legend. So there you go. The public message. Certainty remains the order of the day. Greg Poland from the Mayo Clinic, MMR vaccine does not cause autism. The greatest arrangement of the mind is to believe that something because one wishes it to be so. He wrote this. I love this. Excuse me, little indulgence here. This was Jacobson in Poland. The age-old struggle against anti-vaccinationists. Anti-vaccinationists tend towards complete mistrust of government and manufacturers, conspiratorial thinking, denialism, low cognitive complexity. I love that. In thinking patterns, reasoning flaws, and a habit of substituting emotional anecdotes for data. So there you have it. That's you, lot. Low cognitive complexity. Just bear that in mind. It's a way of saying you're as thick as a plank, but it's just a nice way of doing it. In fact, there are two papers that have come out, one from this country, one from Italy, looking at those who actually question vaccines and don't want to vaccinate according to the schedule or at all. And they show that in fact they're people of higher cognitive complexity. They're those with degrees, professionals. Both papers have shown exactly the same thing. They're the people who think and read and write and communicate and investigate, who have come to the conclusion that they don't believe what they're being told. Nonetheless, but look at this. This is just one day's headlines. One day's headlines from last week. And this is, you're getting blamed for everything. I mean, we've been banned from Amazon. Vax was banned from Amazon. Vax was a very, very successful film, and it was on Amazon. It made Bezos a lot of money, and then he was told by Adam Schiff, I had this wonderful quote the other day, from Trey Gowdy, who I love. And Trey Gowdy said, Adam Schiff, this is in relation to his role as on the Intelligence Committee, said he's as leaky as a screen door on a submarine, which I thought was just wonderful. Anyway, Schiff wrote to Bezos and others and said, you've got to ban these people from social media. And Bezos did, but he's a smart guy. He didn't ban the sale of the DVD. So it went up to number 4 in total DVD sales immediately. It was above the Academy Award-winning film, The Green Book. So he kind of drove the market. He kind of said, buy one while you can. I mean, the man's a capitalist. I love it. And anyway, we sold a bunch of film, but this is where we are. Those who question vaccination are getting blamed. But you can see that that's not the problem. The problem is very, very much more complex than that. So, in the meantime, those of us suffering from low cognitive complexity remain perplexed as to why autism affects 1 in 33 American children. It's the latest data, the latest screening data from this country. Why the CDC, the FDA, and industry scientists should have to conceal compelling data of a causal association. William Thompson disclosed in Vax that they had identified the fact that MMR vaccine was causally associated with MMR vaccine in 2001, and they decided to conceal that information from the public and destroy the documents. This wasn't an anti-vaccine film. It was a story about a CDC whistleblower saying that they had committed fraud. And the interesting thing about it is that age of exposure was the risk. Come back to age of exposure. And why has the vaccine court compensated many children with vaccine-induced autism? It used to be that it was an automatically compensable reaction, autism, encephalopathy leading to autism. And that all changed when the numbers of autistic children whose parents were citing vaccine injury became too great. They had to protect the program. The latest case that was won by a law firm in Florida was for $101 million for vaccine-induced autism. That is why they have to stop this, because it will bankrupt the country. So, are their fears merited? Are our fears merited? Outbreak of measles among person with prior evidence of immunity in New York City. These are recent headlines. A measles outbreak occurred in New York City. All cases had prior evidence of measles immunity. Symptoms were consistent with measles. The index case had 2 doses of measles containing vaccine. This was a vaccinee spreading a vaccine virus to susceptibles who had already been vaccinated. This is horizontal transmission. In California in 2015, there was an outbreak in Disneyland that led to SB 277, the passage of mandatory vaccination laws in California. You could not get your child educated in private or public education unless they were fully compliant with the CDC's recommended schedule. That was in 2015. This is the information that now quietly emerges. During the measles outbreak in California in 2015, a large number of suspected cases occurred in recent vaccinees. Of 194 measles virus sequences obtained in the United States in 2015 from cases of measles, 73 were identified as vaccine sequences. In other words, almost half of the cases that were cited in the media of measles, for which you and others were blamed, were caused by the vaccine. Now imagine if you had gone to your elected officials and say, we want to pass a mandatory vaccination bill that forces all children in California to comply with the CDC schedule, and half of the cases in California at the time were caused by the vaccine. Well, they'd laugh you out of the door. It's half caused by the vaccine, half caused by natural measles. They're just as bad as each other. How can we possibly force vaccination? So you don't publish that, Dad. You don't publish that. You don't publish that until 2019, when the law has already been passed. This is an absolute disgrace. Absolute disgrace. So, during measles outbreak investigation, rapid detection of measles virus reactions, this is what they say. The merit of this is necessary to avoid unnecessary public health interventions. I'll tell you what was an unnecessary public health intervention, and that was the passage of SB 277, and we now know that. This is, I hate to say it, those who know me well will know this isn't like me, but I was right. It's not like me to say that. I mean, it's terribly un-British, but there you go. This is a paper that was just published. I had to give my presentation I had to update it last night. This is from Korea in Vaccine, an increasing potentially measles-susceptible population over time after vaccination in Korea. Measles vaccine was available in Korea from 1964. There was a resurgence, just as there was in America after the honeymoon period, 2013 and 14. Most affected were under 1 year or older, and they were recipients of the 2-dose vaccine. That same displacement in age of exposure, and of those with measles, 46.8 were vaccinated, 36% were unvaccinated, the others were of unknown vaccines. Now, of course, the 36% who are unvaccinated, they're going to be the majority of those under 1. So that number of measles who were vaccinated in the older group is going to be higher. What they're seeing is an increase in the number of measles susceptibles accumulating over time because the vaccine, 1, doesn't work in the first place, and 2, is failing. In other words, you're seeing the destruction of natural herd immunity. And that's the takeaway message, is that nature was doing an extremely good job, and vaccination has destroyed natural herd immunity. There is a move amongst some at the World Health Organizations to declare breastfeeding unnatural, to discourage breastfeeding in third world countries. Why? Because the immunity, the passive immunity that comes with breast milk, is interfering with seroconversion to the vaccine when given under the age of 1. And so in preference to vaccination, which is natural, breastfeeding is now unnatural. How extraordinary that we have entered this kind of situation. And perhaps upon reflection, we should have heeded Sir Graham Wilson in 1961. Perhaps we should ask, as Pasteur clearly did on his deathbed. Pasteur himself kept an open mind in coming to the conclusion that Bernard, his great adversary at this time, is right. The germ is nothing. The terrain is everything. The person, of course, being the terrain. What is it about that child, that terrain, that makes them vulnerable rather than the push to universal vaccination, at least in first world countries? This is it, described in a wonderful and tragic book by Hornblum and Newman about the conduct of measles vaccine trials in mentally defective children in Willowbrook School in the 50s and 60s. A quite extraordinary story of how they took these expendable children and experimented on them. The utilitarian calculus of convenience, self-interest, and the chance of a grand scientific payoff, to which I would add grand financial payoff. So where does this go? People talk about the coming plague. One plague is already here, and that is a plague of neurodevelopmental and chronic immune system disorders in children and young adults. More than 50% of American children have a chronic medical disorder right now. And we are headed to a rate of autism of 1 in 2 by 2032 if we do not stop this. And these numbers are based upon the CDC's continuous monitoring of autism numbers over time. But perhaps another waits in the wings, another coming plague, while center stage the battles between germ and terrain, caution and certainty, profit and loss play out. Waiting in the wings may in fact be an old adversary, in the familiar guise, unfamiliar guise of an ambitious understudy, and that is measles. And this is the conclusion I come to, is that perhaps they know this, and I suspect some of them do. People like Greg Poland, the smarter ones amongst them, know this. They know this. This is their greatest fear, and one of their own creation, one of their own certainty. And as for the certainty of vaccinologists, every certainty is an empty throne. Those who knew but one path would come to worship it, even as it led to the cliff's edge. Thank you very much.